What is childhood trauma and how is it affecting my life now? You've tuned in to When Your Mind Becomes the Scene of the Crime podcast. I'm Dr. Linda F. Williams. I take survivors of abuse and trauma from pain to purpose so that you take back your power, tap into the truth of who you are, and live your best life now. One of you asked in the wake of the Anne Hayes tragedy for me to talk about childhood trauma and how it affects us as adults. I don't know enough about Anne's situation to speak to her particular circumstances, but I will today go over what childhood trauma is and the different areas of our lives that may be affected by that. Now, before I go into this, please understand, number one, you could have 3 different siblings in the same household with the same kind of trauma going on at the same time. And each one will address it, process it differently. It will affect each of their adult lives differently or not at all, depending upon how they deal with or don't deal with it. So none of these things that I'm speaking today are boilerplate to say that if you went through ABC trauma, that now it's gonna affect your adult life C, D, E. We're human beings, that the complexities of the human psyche cannot be boilerplated like that. So understand that as we talk through these generalities. The other thing is that research has determined the degree to which the length of how long the trauma occurred and what type of trauma it is will all affect whether or not certain of these areas might affect you. So I'm just giving you these generalities. Everything that I do on this channel is related to trauma in our adult lives. But in this particular video, I'm talking about childhood trauma and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's get into it. Childhood abuse can take the following forms: physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, or neglect. Physical abuse: anything that can cause injury to the child, whether it actually shows a bruise or not. If you're physically assaulting a child, it is child abuse. Now, society now says that the corporal punishment that we endured coming up in the 50s and the 60s, where the teacher could smack your hands with a ruler or put you over her lap and spank you, is considered child abuse by today's standards. But anything you do, I know some people who have endured actual beat downs as if they were an adult at the hands of a father or a mother. It's all considered child abuse. The next type is sexual abuse. Sexual abuse involves sexual engagement by an adult, older person, or authority figure entrusted to care for the child. Any type of inappropriate touching, exposing that child to any kind of suggestive actions, anything. This can occur with somebody who's still considered a minor, say 16, 17, 18, but they're still subjecting this child to that type of sexual abuse. It's still considered abuse, regardless of the situation, the circumstances, or the venue. The next form is psychological. That involves a deliberate action to create fear in, or an action that's intended to injure the child's dignity and psychological well-being. These can include threats of abandonment, threats to harm the child, threats to harm people or things about which the child cares, berating, disparaging, or scapegoating a child, confining a child, such as putting them in a closet or tying them to a chair, physical humiliations, standing naked in front of others as an example, coercing the child to inflict pain on themselves. Now, I know a bunch of this stuff sounds way out the box, but it happens. And these are just examples of the psychological abuse that can occur. But in my opinion, psychological abuse includes any type of neglect. Let's deal with neglect now. Neglect is denial of care that threatens the child's emotional or developmental well-being. Now, the reason I, in my own opinion, believe that neglect is a form of psychological abuse as well is because any time that you interrupt the developmental process, you are causing a psychological distress that will follow that child into teenage and adolescent years and into adulthood. And by interrupting that developmental process, you cause what is sometimes referred to as arrested development, where, and I've talked about this on some of my other videos, where as an adult, we are on some level still at the age emotionally at which the interruption occurred. So if a child is 6 years old, for example, we can grow on, get into adulthood, and still function in the world. But on some emotional level, we are still the 6-year-old child. And when I discuss triggers, it is, in this case, tied to that arrested emotional development at age 6. So that as adults, we respond to current situations and circumstances as that 6-year-old child, if that makes any sense. Just refer to any of my other videos where I talked about the big rubber band in your back, and when you're triggered, you're getting snatched back to where the trauma occurred. So from that perspective, neglect can be the foundation of that arrested development, which causes psychological distress going forward. Now let's talk a little bit about what all this means once you get into adulthood. One thing that often occurs are physical symptoms. And this can get frustrating because the doctors, even when childhood trauma is not at the base of it, have trouble diagnosing certain conditions. It can become complex and even more difficult for your primary care physician to understand what's going on with you physically. This is not to say that there isn't something going on with you physically, but what some of us may hear, especially women, which is another whole story down the line here. I won't go into that diatribe right now, but we will be looked at as if we're hypochondriacs, or because the doctor can't put their finger on what the physical problem is, they say that it's a psychological thing. This may or may not be the case, but when you're carrying that kind of stress for such an extended period of time, especially if you're still stuffing it and have not talked it out or addressed it in therapy, then it can cause you to have certain physical ailments. The other thing is emotional dysregulation. Well, that's a big fancy term for addressing the fact that you're flying off the handle at absolutely nothing when other people look at situations like, what is your problem? Okay. And you're getting triggered. And understand me, as I've said in other videos, getting triggered doesn't mean we're flying off the handle or going into a crying jag. But when it comes to our next issue of interpersonal instability, it's our tendency to maybe be continually getting into a pattern of toxic relationships, or we become avoidant. And if we find somebody who's really well adjusted and treating us well, we'll self-sabotage that. On some deeper psychological level, we will not understand why the relationship is not working out, but we're just self-sabotage. Okay, I'm going to mess this up before it messes me up, kind of thing. So those kind of things can definitely happen. Next, we have avoidance. And avoidance is anything you do to avoid sitting with and examining painful experiences. That was protective and helpful during the extended abuse. But what it does now, it keeps us stuck, because you have to have the knowledge of the core causes of the pain in order to navigate and master what it takes to cope with that as an adult. Things like procrastination, passive aggressiveness, and just sitting up ruminating on things that you probably built up in your mind. For example, if one avoidance tactic is talking yourself out of walking into maybe a social event. Again, I told you, it depends on how we each process our stuff. For me, in my marriage, I was avoiding addressing the hardcore issues because of a fear of my ex flying off the handle, becoming angry. I didn't want to deal with that comeback. Another thing I built up was he's not going to tell me the truth anyway. So why frustrate myself with asking the hard questions? There was a lot that went on in that relationship that I avoided through things like humor. We did a lot of laughing together. And so even laughter can be a maladaptive thing if it's used in order to avoid addressing the painful issue that we face. Now, what we have to understand as adults, though, is that we are not going to be fully aware of where we're being avoidant. And generally, when we get into therapy and talk through the pain, our therapists will help us to identify these patterns, these avoided patterns in our lives. But unless and until you get into that kind of therapy, then you are not going to know it. I'll give you an example. I was recently talking to some people who had some traumatic childhood events in their lives. And we were talking about what all of us, we all have similar backgrounds, could do in order to address those issues. And naturally, y'all know me by now. First thing I'm talking about is you need to get into therapy for that. If you got childhood issues, you need somebody who specializes in complex post-traumatic stress disorder, yada, yada. Well, they said, well, so-and-so is in therapy and I'm in therapy, and I challenge that. If you're not talking about the childhood trauma in that therapy session, you are not getting therapy for that core issue. So when I tell you guys or suggest you guys or strongly advise you guys to get into therapy, I'm not talking about just go to therapy and talk about everything but the core issue. I'm talking about get into therapy and talk about the fact that you went through this kind of pain as a child. You have to be willing to talk about that in therapy. Or therapy is going to be beneficial, but the challenge becomes, are you ready, willing, and do you have the courage to bring up the childhood trauma in that therapeutic relationship? If you're talking all around it, denying it, just avoiding it altogether, then you're not getting therapy for that core issue. You're getting therapy for whatever issue you choose to talk about. I hope this makes sense. Re-experiencing the pain through flashbacks or dissociation, I'll put a link to that particular video at the end of this one, are all things that we can experience in adulthood as a result of childhood trauma. We also can experience memory issues and shame, guilt, blaming ourselves, gaslighting ourselves that we had something to do with drawing the abuse or we were the cause of the abuse. All of these are things we can deal with in adulthood. Now, what's needed is we need to heal our inner child. That inner child is jumping up and down and screaming in our face many times, but we don't recognize that dynamic as being a need to heal our inner child. I will do a video on healing the inner child in which I will take a deeper dive into all of these dynamics. Here is a chart of all the complex post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms we will experience in adulthood. To view this more closely after this video plays, just rewind and pause your screen. Starting at the top, hypervigilance. We're always in a state of fight or flight when we've been through childhood trauma, even after the threat has long gone. This keeps you in constant stress. Next, re-experiencing. That's the nightmares, the flashbacks, the vivid intrusive memories. Next, we have the altered attention and consciousness or memory issues. Sometimes you can just have symptoms of not being able to remember certain things that you've been through and done, or even in the course of a day, you can not remember going through something. When you had extreme childhood trauma, you can have this kind of issue. Emotional dysregulation. That's what this whole channel is about, the triggers. Next, interpersonal instability. We're going to always have relationship problems and have trouble feeling close to others. Find ourselves in negative, toxic patterns in our relationships. Find ourselves withdrawing from social situations. Next is belief systems are affected. That's the core cause of all of our triggers, is because these specific abusive and defining moments in our lives alter the belief system to the point where this is what I mean when I talk about looking through life through traumatized glasses. We are looking through the things and the lies that others have hammered into us, and we began to believe, and the altered, unrealistic beliefs that we build up ourselves as we come through the trauma. We've talked about somatic symptoms, physical sensations, overwhelming emotion, fear and horror, panic attacks, and all the physical dynamics that can occur as a result of the heightened state of stress that we live in. Avoidance. Anything you do to avoid the thoughts and memories will always be considered avoiding the pain. We get certain physical cues, emotional cues. And even though we don't want reminders of triggers, as this states here, we still get triggered because as long as we don't deal with the core causes of those triggers, then we're just avoiding them. All of these are signs of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And if you have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, then as I've said before, you need to get into some kind of therapy with a therapist that has dealt with that and knows how to address it. I'm offering a complimentary breakthrough session, 30 minutes. Let's talk about it. Are you seeing any of these dynamics playing out in your life? Is it holding you back? Are you finding that you can't focus through achieving your goals? Are you dissatisfied at work? Are you feeling like you're in the wrong career? Are you feeling like you're out of place? If you're feeling like that you're feeling disjointed and that you can't seem to accomplish the things and the dreams that you know you have, give me a call. Go to the website or click the link below and schedule your complimentary breakthrough session now. Meanwhile, always remember that your greatest power is realized in the truth of who you are. Know that truth. Thank you for joining me today on When Your Mind Becomes the Scene of the Crime podcast. Schedule your free breakthrough session now at lindafwilliams.com. That's lindafwilliams.com.